time in past 2 years. So it is not 5 years or 10 years back somebody had. Now having said that, if we come to this is a crystal clear definition maybe for research time, but when you come to day-to-day living, garden variety of roses, which are not roses where everything is tended off and you're not at the best rose garden of the, what do you get there? There the problem is that things get a little murky and unclear. We do know that a lot of patients, they are diagnosed on the basis of their first symptoms, and we know there are a lot of patients adults who have lymph node TB and also have chest lesion. But because the lymph node TB was visible, an X-ray chest was never done. Is this contact exposure or no exposure? If you say it is extrapulmonary, there is no exposure. But this child has had an exposure because there was a simultaneous. So can we widen the net? So the group went on to say, since there is a possibility, so you have any type of TB in last 2 years, you can consider that as a suspect. Having said that, do not use that as a criteria for diagnosis. We quite often say, oh, this patient has a history of contact and MON2 is positive, therefore the answer to my symptoms or suspect is equivalent to TB diagnosis. That is not correct. First of all, history of contact gives you the same information, what information you get by a positive skin test. Both are suggestive of there being an infection, right? So these are not two additive things, they are actually supplementing each other, they are just one point. So this, the moment we widen the definition of contact, it is important that it does not become the basis for making a diagnosis, it becomes a basis for suspecting TB. The second point is about your question is about newborn diet, newborn mother diet. Again, if the mother has not been treated, is an infectious case and child is exposed, there is no question this is a contact. And you just have to rule out that there is no perinatal transmission and this child has not developed disease. So you rule out active disease because the moment you give INH prophylaxis, it's a single disease drug exposure. So the primary factor for any prophylaxis, newborn or otherwise, is rule out disease, and then only if you have infection but no disease, give prophylaxis. Because it's a post-exposure prophylaxis in those situations. However, a mother who has been on treatment during pregnancy, what happens in that? We know that a mother during pregnancy is also having basilemia. There can be a placental involvement, therefore there can be an infant involvement. The amount of drug which is transmitted to the fetus in utero is not very clearly established, whether it has a therapeutic action or not. So erring on the safe side, people say that even if during pregnancy mother has been treated, you consider as a diet and treat. But if this mother has been treated prior to pregnancy, there is no question of treating this child or giving this child a prophylaxis. So treatment during pregnancy makes it little murkier. There are no clear definitions on that. Diagnosis after pregnancy, there is no question. This is a child who should be given INH prophylaxis. Whether this child can be given BCG, well, there is no INH resistant BCG available to us. Recommendations are give BCG, continue INH. Some people say wait for 3 months before you give BCG because you will lose the benefit of MON2s. You can't use MON2s if you've given BCG at viewpoint. There are differences of that, but I think it's hair splitting. It makes no difference. You can start INH once you know a child has been exposed and mother has to be. In the same vein, I have another question which is on TB relapse, and I can interpret this question two ways, so help me, I do not know what you meant. The title says TB relapse suspected and then says how early can MON2 test be repeated, and is interpretation different compared to test being performed first time? You see, if you are repeating MON2s in a child who is suspect and not necessarily a child who was treated in the past, you have any reason to repeat, and this time the induration comes more than the first time, it makes no difference. The boosting effect, which was earlier talked of, is now considered a normal phenomenon. In fact, in countries who do not have a lot of transmission of disease, like America, they go for two-step testing. And it is the second reaction which is considered normal, because earlier it is felt that immunity the reaction wanes off over a period of time. There is some amnesia which is provoked by a first challenge. However, if you are talking of a TB relapse, that means a patient who was treated in the past comes back to you again with symptoms. There is absolutely no role of MON2 in that situation, because MON2 will remain positive. whether this child has a relapse or no relapse, whether this child is cured or not cured. Monto has no role in those situations. So these are two different ways these questions could be interpreted, and I hope I have been able to answer your question. The third question is, what regime should be followed in case of drug-induced hepatitis? I know Dr. Vipul is standing here wanting to take this mic away from me because he has the responsibility of making sure that all sessions run in time. So I'll just briefly tell you, you take out the rifampicin, INH, pyrazinamide, which is hepatotoxic. First of all, how do you identify drug-induced hepatitis? Drug-induced hepatitis is if you have jaundice or you have SGOT-PT, which are more than 5 times. Symptoms, more than 3 times SGOT-PT. Up to 3 times, because it's rifampicin is an enzyme inducer, we take it as normal. There is no need for routine monitoring of LFT of every child who is on ETT. Once you have diagnosed drug-induced liver injury, what you do is you withdraw hepatotoxic drugs, wait for the enzymes to come normal. Once they have nearly normalized, that means less than 2 times, that's the time you reintroduce one drug at a time. You can start with INH, then add rifampicin, then add pyrazinamide. You can add as early as 2 to 3 days. You don't have to wait for weeks of days that you would introduce it. Equally important, now, what do you do during this period when you have withdrawn rifampicin, INH, and pyrazinamide? You have 2 choices. If this child, let's say, has an isolated lymphadenopathy or a pulmonary complex, does not have a complex disease, you may not give any alternative therapy. But this child has a serious disease, then you have to go for an alternative non-toxic therapy, and what we use is streptomycin, ethambutol, sometimes with fluoroquinolone. Be very wary of using fluoroquinolone because you are losing a second line drug. But in certain desperate situations, if you have a child who has extensive disease, you cannot expose them just to 2 weaker drugs. We know ethambutol is bacteriostatic, so we do add sometimes fluoroquinolone for the period when you have not used these drugs. How do you count the total period of treatment in this situation where about a month was lost during the hepatitis treatment? Well, if this happens before 4 weeks of therapy was given, you forget whatever was given earlier. When all the drugs are induced, start counting from them and then take it to 6 to 9 months, depending on what type of disease you are treating. On the other hand, if it was somewhere in between, consider the period when you were using alternative therapy as Diazinon, as if they did not existed. So period given before and period should be subtracted, and whatever period is left is completed thereafter. That's briefly how we manage drug-induced liver injury.
Thank you, sir. Just to summarize, until unless you see acid-fast bacilli, don't make a diagnosis of TB. Review 10 times before making a diagnosis of tuberculosis. This is what was told to us and was taught to us by sir since ages. Thank you, sir. I would request Dr. Fareedi to honor Dr. Varinder Singh and Dr. S.K. Kabra. Dr. Fareedi doesn't need any introduction. He is head of the department. UCMS has been president IAP Delhi, and currently he is president NNF Delhi chapter. Sir.
It's a double honor for me.
Dr. Vineet doesn't need a memento. He is on the other side of it. And Dr. Fareedi, yours is the next session, so please.
Before we start the next session, just announcement: the Association of Child Neurology and Pushpanjali Crossley Hospital are organizing the Child Neurocon on 16th and 17th February next year, 2013. The theme will be epilepsy and CNS infection. The venue will be Lemon Tree, East Delhi Mall. There will be poster presentations, PG quiz. Registration is 1800. Dr. Anju Agarwal is here, so any of you who want to register can do it with her, and I'm sure she'll give you some early bird discount.
I would request Dr. Fareedi to come on stage and introduce our speakers, Dr. Sujata Sahni, Dr. Madhulika Kabra. Dr. Sujata, please.
Since we are running a little late behind the schedule, I won't go into the semantics and directly invite our first speaker, Dr. Sujata Sahni, who is a rheumatologist at Gangaram Hospital. We have had the infectious disease session in the morning, and be dealing with, although most of our practice actually dealing with the infections, but non-communicable diseases including the rheumatology, including the immunodeficiency situations are also important, and the genetic disorders. So we have got among us Dr. Sujata, who will be speaking on a child with autoimmune disease. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me over this morning to talk to you about autoimmune diseases. Now, basically, the whole area of autoimmune diseases is all about recognizing a clinical disease pattern. However, it is fraught with difficulties because mixed amongst these children with several autoimmune disorders are many mimics. And very, very important is things that we commonly see, such as viral infections, which can be self-limiting and should not be given much of cognizance. But on the other hand, there are some children who may have a lot of serious disorders, and they can sometimes be confused with children who have got connective tissue diseases. Now, for the purpose of this talk this morning, I'm only going to be talking about connective tissue diseases. I do not have the time to deal with either childhood arthritis or systemic vasculitis. So for the purposes of children with connective tissue disease that we will take as a prototype of autoimmune disorders, we have to remember certain things. Number one, when you have a child, for example, with tuberculosis, as you heard in the previous session, you have fever, you have respiratory signs, you have a positive PPD and a chest X-ray that tells you that I've got TB. Well, it's not that easy in children who have rheumatic diseases because these kids often have a vertical disease presentation. So that take a simple example of a child who has systemic scleroderma. You can have Raynaud's with an onset in the year 2000. You can have digital pits in the onset in the year 2005. And you can have interstitial lung disease in the year 2006. So that you have a vertical disease presentation in many pediatric patients with connective tissue diseases. So it's seldom that you can make a spot diagnosis and feel very smart about yourself. It's quite painstaking to make a diagnosis of connective tissue disease. You need a detailed history, a very careful clinical exam, and just a few laboratory tests. Just a minute on the terminology. Earlier on, we used to say that children have collagen vascular diseases. This terminology has been abandoned, and we would rather say that the child has a primary connective tissue disease such as an Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, osteogenesis imperfecta or Stickler's, or in fact an acquired or an inflammatory connective tissue disease. So today I'm going to be talking to you about acquired inflammatory connective tissue diseases. And here we're going to see kids who have lupus, idiopathic inflammatory myositis, of which the prototype is juvenile dermatomyositis, children with scleroderma, MCTD, UCTD, overlap syndromes, and Sjogren's. Now there seems to be a lot of mystery about these diseases, so let's look at them very, very carefully and try and demystify this topic for you. So remember that there are very few classic clinical features for any of these CTDs. Many of these diseases have overlapping clinical features, and there is no distinct confirmatory investigation for any such patient. So in your practice, when would you suspect that a child may have connective tissue disease? A very common manifestation of children with connective tissue disease is fever. Prolonged fever. I'm not talking about a child who's pyrexil for a short period of time. I'm talking about weeks and months of low-grade fever and overriding fatigue and arthralgia. The clinical presence of arthritis, which is defined as a swollen joint, features suggestive of myositis, Raynaud's syndrome that I just spoke about, and remember, Raynaud's is a triphasic change. So you have an abrupt reduction in the blood supply to your digits, because of which initially you have a blanching. Following that, because of a persistent contraction of the blood vessel, you have an increase of deoxygenated hemoglobin so that you have cyanosis, and then you have a reflex hyperemia so that you have a redness. So it's a triphasic change of white, blue and red, and you need at least 2 of these phases to say that the child has got Raynaud's. The skin is a very important window to connective tissue diseases, so that paniculitis, vasculitis, rashes, photosensitivity are all very important. When you have systems involvement, such as a child with a serositis, a nephritis, or an interstitial lung disease, think connective tissue disease, and the investigations we'll come to a little later, they are helpful, but no diagnosis, no investigation can rule out or rule in any CTD. So let's look at our best teachers, and that is our patients. So here's a child who's 15 years old, who's been unwell for 6 weeks, who's had somewhat high-grade fever or poor appetite, no localizing complaints except for oral ulcers, no significant past history. The child has been extensively investigated. She's got normal cell count, slightly low hemoglobin, normal platelet, ESR of 45. Her imaging, including chest X-ray and a CT of the chest and abdomen, are normal. Multiple cultures are negative, and a bone marrow exam is normal. PPD negative, quantiferon gold negative. And you heard earlier that giving a child a trial of ATT is really not a very smart thing to do. So what do? You go back to the patient and examine the child, carefully examine the child, just push the hair back, and there's your diagnosis. And you have a vasculitic rash on the ear of the patient. The child has a normal blood pressure, normal urine exam, and this patient needs one screening investigation to save her from ATT. And what is that screening test? Anybody? It's an ANA, excellent. But it's an ANA on indirect immunofluorescence with the cell line being the Hep2 cell line. And that's the critical take-home message, that ANA by ELISA should not be ordered. When you order an ANA on ELISA, then you are going to make a mistake in about 1 in 3 children. So that's a pretty lousy test to do. So don't ask for an ANA on ELISA. Always look at the ANA and look at the dilution titer. The higher the dilution titer, the more the risk of the child either having or going to develop a connective tissue disease. You know that about 15 to 20% of children can have a normal, can be absolutely normal and yet have an ANA positive, but it's unlikely that that ANA positivity will be in a high dilution titer. And this child had a reduction of C3, normal urinary protein excretion, no active urinary sediment. So the final diagnosis is a lupus in evolution. And remember that the fever in these children is almost universal. So when you have a child with PUO and there's nothing else going on, I urge you to think connective tissue disease. So the ANA is a very sensitive test, but it has a low specificity, and I've already told you about the pattern that you need to look for. And remember that when you are asking for an anti-nuclear antibody test and you get a positive report, then it's much like going to the bar and asking the bartender to mix you your favorite cocktail. So that cocktail has then got many ingredients, and the pattern of the ANA report you see depends upon what is the ingredients against which that patient's immune system is mounting a immune response. So that there are several patterns described, such as peripheral, homogeneous, speckled, etc. And they are all directed against the different nuclear components which all of us have got. And remember that there are boys as well who can get lupus, and the children who are dark skinned can actually get a malar hypopigmentation, as is being shown to you on your right. Adult patients actually walk in with a label and say, I've got lupus, help me. That is to say that the malar rash is a very common clinical manifestation in adults. We don't see that very often in pediatrics. You have to hunt for rashes. So look at this subtle vasculitic rash on the toes of this young child who had got class 4 lupus nephritis. Or look at the discoid lupus rash on the neck of this child that you actually have to hunt for. Or a faint vasculitic rash which is present on the malar area in this young girl with lupus. And here's another child that we picked up to have lupus very recently. And this is a young girl who's 15 years of age, who had pyrexia for 6 to 8 weeks with significant abdominal pain, some nausea and vomiting, where a CT chest showed up a splenic infarct. And this patient indeed had a pancytopenia, and we diagnosed this patient to have catastrophic antibody phospholipid syndrome in association with lupus, because not only did she have splenic infarct, she also had a renal infarct, and she also had ongoing gut vasculitis. So sometimes children can present with single organ involvement with lupus, and that can actually confuse many of us. You're all aware about the ACR 1997 criteria for diagnosing children with lupus, where you needed 4 out of 11, where it's the year 2012 and you have new diagnostic criteria for lupus. In fact, these are classification criteria to fix patients into clinical trials. Now, in clinical practice, many children with lupus would fulfill these criteria, but again, remember, they may be sequential and they may not be concomitantly present. And that's another very important take-home message. So the new criteria now actually have 17 criteria, and the criteria have been split into both clinical criteria and immunological criteria, and the important difference is that to have lupus, you must have at least one of the immunological criteria in addition to the other clinical or more immunological criteria. So I hope I made myself clear that you need to have at least one immunological criteria before you are able to diagnose your patient to have lupus. The number of criteria yet remain 4, the only exception being the child with lupus nephritis who is ANA positive. So the early features which are not included in the American College of Rheumatology criteria, especially for the pediatrician, is prolonged fever, fatigue, arthralgia, and failure to thrive. Children with lupus have some special features, and just look at this very nice study which was done by Hermine Brunner et al. From Cincinnati, which shows that if you look at childhood onset lupus and adult onset, the steroid dose requirement for pediatric lupus is much higher, so extremely significant. The disease burden is much higher and the renal disease is much higher. So bottom line is that kids with lupus tend to have aggressive disease. And one size doesn't fit all, because children with lupus can have very minor organ lupus such as some arthritis and mucositis. You can actually have a major organ lupus such as a pancytopenia or the presence of lupus nephritis. And then there are children who sometimes have persistent active disease. So to summarize, lupus is a multisystem disorder. Fever is often a presenting feature. You all know that ANA and not double-stranded DNA is a screening test. CRP is often normal in these children, and when you have persistent pyrexia in the presence of more than one organ involvement, think lupus. So the presence of arthritis and a rash and fever, the presence of nephritis and oral ulcers, the presence of vasculitis and serositis, think lupus for your patient. So the lupus is the classical prototype of a pediatric autoimmune disease. And remember that there are several things that should help you as a pediatrician to think of a connective tissue disease. So the first thing is prolonged marked constitutional symptoms without a diagnosis. The second is unusual presenting features. For example, children who have skin vasculitis with constitutional features, and then children who have more than one organ involvement, but again over a period of time. So it's very unusual for a child to have ITP in the year 2006, and to have a pleural effusion in the year 2007, and to have a nephrotic syndrome in the year 2008. So look at that thread together and your patient has most likely got lupus and not 3 different diverse clinical conditions. And when you look at series of children with pyrexia of unknown origin, about 5 to 20 are rheumatologic. Though I'm going to cover only the first few for you today, remember vasculitic syndromes, autoinflammatory syndromes, Behçet's, inflammatory bowel disease, sarcoidosis, and many others can present to you just with PUO. So you must think out of the box and out of infections when you have children who have prolonged pyrexia. But remember that infections and malignancies are 2 important mimics that are sometimes not very easy to tease out. Let's look at the next CTD that you should not miss. And this is a story of a 3-year-old child from Bangladesh who has a photosensitive facial rash, and he's got these lumps and bumps coming out. Anybody? What is this? This is calcinosis. So he's got calcinosis coming out, but he's had no diagnosis and he's been around town. And why is that? Because his muscle enzymes are normal. But remember, if you leave the muscles of a 3-year-old child inflamed for long enough, they're going to exhaust themselves and you're not going to find any elevation of CPK in the serum after a while. So remember, chronic untreated juvenile dermatomyositis can sometimes have normal muscle enzymes, and clearly this patient has no differential, but it took years for him to reach a final diagnosis. We've been following up for several years and he's well grown and doing very fine right now. And remember that we don't go in for invasive investigation in children such as EMGs and biopsies very often. The MRI is an excellent tool, and here's a stir film of the MRI showing you marked muscle inflammation, and here's a picture on your right side showing you complete resolution. So the MRI is a very good tool to help you. And what about this young child? This is a child who's got marked anasarca and several urine exams which are completely normal. There is no proteinuria. So where are you going to go from here? Clinically examine the patient carefully. You find that she's lying on the bed and is unable to sit up without support. And here's an MR imaging which is showing you not only muscle inflammation but also subcutaneous edema. So remember, Anasaka in a child who's not well, who doesn't have a hypoalbuminemia, who doesn't have a nephrotic syndrome, think out of the box and think whether the child could have juvenile dermatomyositis, and here's the child before and after treatment, right? So that's another important differential in these children. So juvenile dermatomyositis is much commoner than the other forms of idiopathic inflammatory myositis, to the extent that polymyositis and other subtypes are perhaps less than 5% in pediatric practice. So the presence of proximal muscle weakness with a classic rash really has no differential. The Peter and Bohan criteria, which are very invasive, are usually not used today, and we have several newer diagnostic criteria that have been put forward and are now actually being validated. So what is this child showing you? What's the clinical sign? What is this clinical sign? Anybody? That's a heliotrope rash. Excellent. And what is this? This skin vasculitis. And what is this? This is also a malar rash. So remember that even children with juvenile dermatomyositis can have a malar rash, but these children have involvement of the nasolabial fold, and the separation of normal to abnormal skin is quite subtle. And in kids with lupus, the malar rash is very distinctly demarcated from the normal skin that these children have. And what is this? What is this? Subtle but definitely there, Gottron's papules. And what is this child showing you? This child is showing you that many children with juvenile dermatomyositis will develop arthritis over the years if they're not adequately treated, and some of them can also have the Raynaud's phenomena. And what is this child having? Anybody? He's got a lump of calcium being extruded here and a lot of liquefied calcium sitting there under the skin. So that is why it is so important for us to pick up children with idiopathic inflammatory myositis, because once they have calcinosis, and if they are unfortunate enough to develop severe calcinosis, it's sadly completely untreatable. And remember, 20% of children will have a normal CPK, and if you leave that kid for long enough, all the muscle enzymes are going to be normal. So think juvenile dermatomyositis with skin rashes and proximal muscle weakness. So here's another mysterious disease for pediatricians, scleroderma. Now remember that scleroderma in children is in the overwhelming majority of a subtype called localized scleroderma. Very few children have systemic scleroderma, perhaps just 1 in a million. So they are two distinctly different diseases, with the overriding feature being the presence of scleroderma, that is hard, tight, inelastic skin and subcutaneous tissue. And there are new classification criteria for juvenile systemic scleroderma. Remember just one thing from your standpoint, that if you have a child with systemic scleroderma, they have years and years of Raynaud's phenomena. So when you have children with Raynaud's phenomena, you must think carefully, is it a primary or a secondary Raynaud's, and accordingly look for clues that point you towards the diagnosis of children with connective tissue diseases. And this is the edematous phase of early systemic scleroderma, when the child is unable to make a full fist. Now for all of us, we can make a full fist and there is no gap, so that you cannot insert the finger here, right? Now here's a child who has got inability to make a full fist. Now this can happen with arthritis, but remember, it can happen in the edematous phase of scleroderma as well. So that the clinical examination is very important, and clinical exam will tell you, is this edematous scleroderma or does this child have a polyarthritis? And this is late phases of systemic scleroderma. Here's a 20-year-old young lady with the classic pinched facies. Here's a child with digital pits, and what's happened here? Auto-infarction of the digits because of severe Raynaud's. So it's a very nasty disease. And here's another child with the facies, which is classic of systemic scleroderma, and marked contracture so that she cannot straighten out the elbow. And this disease, that is systemic scleroderma, is divided into two types, the diffuse and the limited, and that depends upon the degree of skin involvement and certain specific autoantibodies. And here's the presence of aggressive prolonged interstitial lung disease with honeycombing, and here's a child who's showing you barium swallow abnormalities with marked esophageal dilatation as well. So systemic scleroderma is not skin limited, it is in fact a systemic disorder, which is why it has its name. And contrast this with the most common form of scleroderma in pediatrics, and that is localized scleroderma, and there are several subtypes of that, What is this child showing you? What is this area on the face? Anybody? This is a patch morphea. And what is this child showing you? What, is there any abnormality? Okay, which is the abnormal side in this child? Right or the left? Excellent. And that is a area of linear scleroderma. Okay. And what is this young boy showing you? What is this triangular lesion on the face? And that is called encoupe de Sabre. That is to say that as if the face has been bisected with a sword. So the three forms of localized scleroderma are patch morphea, linear scleroderma and encoupe de Sabre. And remember, it is this subtype that can actually present you sometimes with uveitis, with calcifications in the cerebrum and seizures as well. Can I get a minute? Okay. So, and here's another young lady who's got dramatic area of generalized morphea. And what is this patient showing you now? So here's a young lady who's 12 years of age who's come across with puffy hands. Now look carefully and see the dorsum of both the hands is swollen, as are all the digits, and this swelling is not confined to any particular joint. And what is the diagnosis for this child? It's classic feature of mixed connective tissue disease, and the serological test which should be positive in these patients is a U1-RNP. So pediatric rheumatology is like a picture atlas, and if you've seen it once and you understand what it is, you can really help out these children. And there are some kids who actually even have two distinct diseases in one patient, and those children are actually said to have overlap connective tissue diseases. What about Sjogren's syndrome? Sjogren's syndrome can be either primary or secondary. It is said to be primary when it occurs as a standalone disease, and secondary when it occurs in association with other rheumatic diseases. And the commonest reason for Sjogren's syndrome in pediatrics is usually secondary when the child has got lupus. But we do have some kids who have primary Sjogren's syndrome, and here's a young boy who's got a dramatic parotid swelling which was actually bilateral. So when you have bilateral parotid swellings, think out of the box, think out of mums and HIV, and think, could my patient have Sjogren's syndrome as well? So just like we don't have any gastroenterology panels and we don't have infectious disease panels, we don't have endocrine panels, there is no role for ordering a rheumatology panel. So there's no point saying that I think my patient has got a rheumatic disease and let me run an RF, ANA, ACPA and an ANCA. I promise you one of them will come positive and you'll be in trouble. Because then you'll be trying to fit that positive test into your patient rather than the other way around, looking at your patient and understanding what is the test I need to order for this patient. Because the ANA, the rheumatoid factor, the P-ANCA, and sometimes in Down syndrome children, the anti-CCP antibody can turn positive. So that a positive test doesn't mean your patient has the disease. Please remember that. No test can rule in or rule out a rheumatic disorder. But this is a very nice algorithm published a few years ago. Okay, I'm leaving. Okay. So the screening test, remember, for most connective tissue diseases is a ANA. So suffice it to say that don't order for very many tests if the ANA is negative. I think it's time for me to go before I'm fired at. So in summary, connective tissue diseases are a group of overlapping disorders of unknown etiology. The clinical and laboratory features are not exclusive from one disease to the other and are sometimes overlapping. Features can occur sequentially. Overlap syndromes can sometimes occur, and from your point of view, early recognition is the best you can do for the child to offer the best therapy and limit damage. If children get specific therapy late, then they have a very morbid existence, but if they get the proper therapy early on, they can have an excellent quality of life. And here's a young lady showing you that even though I have every swollen joint, nothing stops me from putting green nail polish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sujata. Actually, we would have loved to listen to you more, but time is not permitting me. And I'm sure by her talk, the audience will become wiser now to at least find out some of these cases which are roaming around and walking in your office practice every day. Thank you very much, dear. We take up the question after the another talk. Now invite Dr. Madhulika, who is known very well in the circular hours, and I'm sure she'll be speaking on child with inborn metabolism. And kindly be in time so that we finish. We have some time for discussion after your talk. Dr. Madhulika.
Good afternoon. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here and interacting with you in this particular area. And I think it is very important for the pediatricians to learn something about this area because they would come across these patients quite frequently. So what I plan to do today in my talk is that I will make you familiar with the usual scenarios with which these patients present with, and there you really need to have a high index of suspicion so that you do not miss these cases. So we will talk of some red flags. What should be the approach when you are suspecting a child to have an inborn error of metabolism? We will also see that how simple investigations can give you clues and you can reach to a diagnosis and start treating them. We will discuss about importance of confirmation, and then if time permits, we will take some prototype cases. So this is a very, very usual scenario for all pediatricians that a normal baby is born, term, good weight baby, discharged on day 2, parents are happy. The baby comes back on day 7 with features which we suspect as having sepsis. We investigate the child for sepsis. Everything being positive, still we keep the diagnosis as query sepsis meningitis, treat the baby as sepsis meningitis, and the baby dies. The story doesn't finish here, and the next pregnancy, the couple has another baby, this time a male child, again a term child, has the same course, symptomatic on day 5 this time, again the same investigations are done, and the septic screen is negative again, and this time somebody thinks that is it something else or is it really sepsis, and here we start thinking of inborn errors of metabolism. So you see here that the presentation of IEMs, the most severe forms which present in the newborn period mimic sepsis and encephalopathy. So I think it is very, very important that we suspect these cases early. Now this particular case, this is a real case actually. When this baby was investigated, in fact, the screening investigations for IEMs were normal, ammonia being normal, blood gas normal, but then we did urine ketones and urine ketones were positive, and a DNPH test which also indicates keto acids were positive. So here we need to remember all ill newborns, especially with encephalopathy, where you are not able to find a common cause, do urine ketones. If urine ketones are positive, think in terms of an organic acidemia. If there is hypoglycemia and urine ketones are negative, think in terms of fatty acid oxidation defects. A very, very simple test, okay? So the bell should ring here. Now this baby, when we did the neuroimaging, we found that the baby had significant brain edema, and because the DNPH was positive and brain edema was there, we suspected that this is maple syrup urine disease, and it indeed turned out to be maple syrup urine disease. The baby died, but we were able to counsel the family for the next pregnancy. Look at this another scenario where you have a normal 12-year-old child who comes to you with history of 2 episodes of vomiting, irritability, behavioral problems, and parents feel that both the times the child was ill, once the child was ill and the other time the child had eaten too much. Then the child became very irritable, vomited repeatedly. The only treatment they gave was put the child on IV fluid, and the child became normal after a few days. When the child came to us in the 3rd episode, we thought that it could be an episodic presentation of an inborn error of metabolism, and when we investigated the child's ammonia was high, and ultimately a diagnosis of OTC deficiency, which is a urea cycle defect, was made, and the child is doing extremely well on protein restriction and oral benzoate therapy. So, episodic presentation where the children are normal in between. We should always suspect an intermittently presenting inborn error of metabolism. So with this background, let us have an overview and approach to a child with inborn error of metabolism. Inborn errors of metabolism are caused because of block at some point in the metabolic pathway. Most of these are autosomal recessive, which means the risk of recurrence in subsequent pregnancy is 25%. They pathophysiologically, biochemically, they are very different. The phenotype can be overlapping. So that's why we need to investigate these children with many investigations simultaneously. We also need to understand that virtually any organ system can be involved, or you can just have a generalized systemic illness, and they are generally progressive if untreated. So this is just to show you the diagrammatic, very simplified picture of inborn error of metabolism, where you have a block here, and because of this, a substrate A cannot be converted into a compound B, and because of this, there's a deficiency of B, and there's accumulation of alternate pathway. Because of the alternate pathway, there's accumulation of certain substance, and this causes a disturbance in the metabolism and the symptomatology of inborn errors. Now, we really don't know in India what is the extent, but the people who practice clinical genetics and metabolics, they know that these are probably uncommonly identified and these are missed. But according to the international data, about 3 to 4 per thousand live births is the frequency, and about 20% of acute illnesses in the newborn in the developed countries are because of inborn errors of metabolism. If we would like to know about the distribution of these, out of these, organic acidurias are the commonest, followed by the urea cycle defects. And we also need to remember that the majority of them would present either in the neonatal period or in early childhood, but then no age is exempt. Amongst the pediatricians, amongst all of us, there is a misconception that biochemical pathways are extremely complex and it's just impossible to diagnose these patients. But then, believe me, this is not true. We need not go in the details of the biochemical pathway. A general approach is always helpful. And the other misconception is that it's difficult to conduct a diagnostic study. It used to be a few years back, but now we have most of the investigations available in our country. Now, to understand the presentation of these inborn errors of metabolism, we need to understand that there are 3 types of presentations broadly. And in today's presentation, we are focusing on the small molecule disease because there's no time to discuss the large molecule diseases. So, small molecule diseases, which are primarily aminoacidopathies, organic acidurias, are presenting acutely with intoxication and encephalopathy. On the other hand, the chronically presenting diseases or the large molecule disease, they would be usually little later onset and gradually progressive, would involve central nervous system, and they can involve any organ system in the body, commonly present with cardiac involvement and organomegaly. And as I said, there can be intermittent forms of these small molecule diseases which can present with intermittent episodes of exacerbations. There can be any system involvement, as I said. There can be cardiac syndromes, neurologic syndrome, hepatic syndromes, or storage and dysmorphism. So, as a pediatrician, we need to have a very high index of suspicion because these disorders mimic many common pediatric illnesses like neonatal sepsis, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. We should suspect these disorders when there is unexplained metabolic derangements, there's a family history, there's a consanguinity, and very importantly, if there is unexplained acute illness in a previously well child. And as I said earlier, episodic illnesses when the children are normal in between, we should always think in terms of inborn errors. For small molecule diseases, the common presentations are lethargy, poor feeding, vomiting, intractable seizures, again in a previously well child. You can have unusual body and urine odors, but they're not that easy to identify. You have failure to thrive in addition to other symptoms. Failure to thrive alone would not give you a very good yield. You can have skin and hair changes, you can have eye changes, organomegaly, genital ambiguity, jaundice. So any of these symptoms can be there in many inborn errors of metabolism. In the lab side, if you have persistent or recurrent hypoglycemia, intractable acidosis with increased anion gap, we need to think in terms of IEMs. In urea cycle disorders, you can have alkalosis, you can have pancytopenias, leukopenia, thrombocytopenia, again in many organic acidemias. So all these should give you small clues in scenarios where you are clinically suspecting inborn errors. Large molecule disease, on the other hand, though we are not talking about them, they may present even in utero, though usually they would present late. In utero, presentation can be as high drops, and the later presentation can be coarse facial features, progressive neurological deterioration, unexplained neurological symptoms, organomegaly, and skeletal involvement. It is also important to know that when we should not suspect inborn error of metabolism. So investigating these children inadvertently also doesn't really make any sense. So only moderate developmental delay, delayed speech, isolated failure to thrive, infrequent seizures, and defined epileptic syndromes usually will not give you a very good yield. Now, as I said, as symptoms give you clues, some signs can give you very good clues. As you are all aware, ambiguous genitalia can be there in congenital adrenal hyperplasia, hair and skin changes can be there in biotinidase deficiency, you can have structural brain abnormality in hyperglycemia, large head size in glutaric acidemia, and so on and so forth. So you can have some features which might give you clues for a diagnosis. So these are some of the pictures, and I thought we would have some interaction, but then I'll just tell you the diagnosis here. These two children have Zellweger syndrome. They were actually, this boy was misdiagnosed as Down syndrome, referred as Down syndrome. This child had biotinidase deficiency, came with these sparse hair and seizures, responded very well to biotin. This child has actually mucolipidosis. So this is a large molecule disease but presents early. This is a child with Menkes kinky hair disease. You see these very abnormal hair. And this is a child with congenital disorder of glycosylation, which can also present very early with developmental delay. So what is the need to work up these children? The need to work up is there because we need to have a specific diagnosis, not only for telling the diagnosis to the patients. There is treatment available for many of these disorders. It is required for genetic counseling and for prenatal diagnosis. The pictures you are seeing here at the top are two children with phenylketonuria who are under treatment and doing extremely well. This is a girl with MPS I. Many of our children with MPS I and Gaucher are now being treated with enzyme replacement therapy. And this is a baby with Pompe disease for whom treatment was started on day 20 of birth with enzyme replacement. So treatment is also available now. It is not only that we are interested in diagnosis. Now, when you are suspecting an inborn error of metabolism, what investigations are important? Some of the common investigations like blood sugar, calcium, liver function, blood count, a urine metabolic screen, and 4 simple tests. I think if you do, you can classify these disorders and start treating them empirically. So arterial blood gases, blood lactate, blood ammonia, and urine ketones. These are 4 important tests which may give you clues. And then depending on what investigation reports you get, you can do other further tests. You may be helped with neuroimaging, enzyme or tissue diagnosis. And I would like to have a small word about these 3 specific tests in red at the bottom. The HPLC, which is high performance liquid chromatography, the tandem mass spectrometry, and the gas chromatography mass spectrometry. For pediatricians, tandem mass they are doing very frequently. We will talk a little bit about this, and this is usually used as a screening test for organic aciduria and aminoacidopathies. HPLC is primarily for aminoacidopathies, and GCMS is for organic acids. Other clues and investigations could be a macrocytic anemia, which can be because of a cobalamin defect. Low cholesterol can be there in peroxisomal disorders. Increased triglycerides can give you clues for GSD. Increased CK can be there in GSD again. A low CSF sugar can be there in glucose transport defect, and so on and so forth. Now, a word about the tandem mass spectrometry. This test is being used very frequently by the pediatricians. It's a very good test because there are many tests done in a single assay, and we cover a wide range of disorders. The only thing which I would like to convey here is that it identifies the pattern of the disorder, and in most situations you have to do a confirmatory diagnosis. So you will be able to say this child probably has an organic aciduria, or based on the amino acid pattern you may be able to identify aminoacidopathy, but later on you will have to do an organic acid analysis or a HPLC to confirm the diagnosis. So with these investigations, let us see how do we approach if you have a child in that clinical scenario. So the first step, or simultaneously what we do is that we do a blood ammonia test along with a blood gas. So if you have a blood gas which is normal and ammonia which is high, you are dealing with a urea cycle defect. On the other hand, if you have a normal ammonia, but there is acidosis but no ketosis, you are probably dealing with a fatty acid oxidation defect. Or if you have a blood gas which is normal, but there is ketosis with or without lactic acidosis, you may still have organic acidemias and mitochondrial disorders. So just these 2 tests, ammonia and blood gas, can give you clues that which group of disorder you are working for. If you have metabolic acidosis, okay, with increased anion gap, as I have already said. Then in this situation, we all know that metabolic acidosis can be because of loss of bicarb, but here we are talking of metabolic acidosis because of accumulation of acid, because of increase in ion gap, and this could be lactate, ketones, or organic acid. So here, most likely, we are dealing with an organic aciduria if you have metabolic acidosis with or without hyperammonemia. On the other hand, if you do not have acidosis, but you have hyperammonemia, and this is a usual presentation of hyperammonemia, we would always repeat ammonia, and then based on that, we will classify these children into urea cycle defects, investigate them further with HPLC to classify them further. If ammonia is also normal and the blood gas is also normal, then you are probably dealing with some of the aminoacidopathies, which could be something like non-ketotic hyperglycemia or other carbohydrate-related disorders like galactosemia. So once you do these tests, I think you are able to classify these children well. So as I said, with these 4 simple tests, you are able to classify these disorders into organic acidemias, MSUD, urea cycle disorders, and other disorders. Now, this is our experience with investigating these so-called high-risk children for evidence of inborn errors of metabolism. About 660 patients were referred, this is an old data, referred for diagnosis, and if we exclude the mitochondrial disorders, about 14% were identified to have an IAM. The commonest inborn error was organic acidemia, MMA being the commonest, and what we found was that the yield was most when we included children with a complex presentation. And what do I mean by that is that in isolation, if the child only had developmental delay or only seizures, the yield was poor. But if the child had seizures, developmental delay, and a lab derangement or an abnormal neurological finding or imaging, the yield was more. So you can see the majority are complex presentations. And when we tried to analyze the predictors, what we found was that the biggest predictor was that if you have a complex presentation, the odds of having an IEM was tuned to 7 as compared to in isolation where it was very low. So that's the message here is that you need to have a complex presentation to investigate these children, but not saying that in isolation this may not be present. When we collect samples, we need to keep this in mind that before we start specific treatment, the samples should be collected. Samples like serum ammonia and lactate should be immediately tested. There's no point transporting these samples because the values are going to be high otherwise. In children where we are suspecting an IEM and the baby is very sick and we do not have time to investigate, it is always important to store samples, and not only blood, I think urine is the very, very precious sample here, and we may need to keep some biopsies also. I will skip management because these are just 2 slides for management, and this will depend on what disorder you are thinking of. And the diagnosis is definitely important when we not only to treat these children, but tell them the risk of recurrence, telling them the possibility of therapy, prenatal diagnosis, and even carrier screening if you have facilities available for that. If we have time, we can take 2-3 cases. I think we have some time, sir. Can we take 2-3 cases? Okay, so I'll just try to take 2-3 prototype cases just to understand whether you have understood whatever I have told you till now. So this particular girl actually came to us at 3 months of age. And the couple was non-consanguineous, again a term baby. She had a history of delayed cry. She had history of multifocal clonic seizures since birth, and at 3 months the milestones were not very reliable, but then the child did not have social smile till now. Now here the red flag was that there was a family history of a SIP death, and this child, because of delayed cry, was referred as a case of birth asphyxia. When we examined, there was nothing actually other than some increased tone and microcephaly, and as I said, referred as HI sequelae, but because there was a family history, we investigated the child, and the child had metabolic acidosis, ammonia was normal, MRI did show features which suggest HIE. So keep this in mind that it is not that metabolically affected children will not have HIV. They can have HIV, they can have sepsis also. So where does this child fall in our algorithm? So this child had acidosis and ammonia was normal. So we suspected this child to be having an organic aciduria or a mitochondrial disorder, and she indeed turned out to be having methylmalonic acidemia. So the first child also probably had the same disorder. Okay. Then now case 2. This baby, again with history of 2 neonatal deaths, so again a red flag here. Again the same scenario as I discussed, sepsis, meningitis, 2 babies died, and this time the baby again was normal for 2 days and then again has features of sepsis. And because we had the history in hand, we investigated this child, and this child actually had a very high ammonia. You can see here the ammonia was 800 microgram per DL, and here now we suspect what group of disorders? Urea cycle defect. So this child had a high ammonia, everything else was normal, so we thought of a urea cycle defect, and when we did the urine GCMS for this child and the HPLC for this child turned out to be having citrullinemia. The baby was very sick, we did everything possible, but the baby died, but we were able to do mutation studies for this patient, and then we could offer prenatal diagnosis in the subsequent pregnancy. Okay, so this is another one, very interesting. So this child, just 4 years old boy, came with global delay, speech and motor, and the parents were consanguineous. The only thing the parents were very consistent about that the child is very irritable. The child is very irritable and he is very unusual. And when we looked at the child, he looked absolutely normal. He was irritable, that was one thing. So only because of the consanguinity and irritability, we investigated the child, and a simple urine test clinched the diagnosis. The DNPH was positive, and the urine TLC, the simple test, showed branch chain aminoaciduria, and the child actually had MSUD. And can you imagine this child having MSUD? So this child had a milder form of MSUD. He was started on special diet, though he had some delay. He picked up milestones later, and he is doing quite well now. So simple clues. I think irritability is one feature which is very, very important clue which gives you for inborn error of metabolism. Case 4. Here, this is a 15-month-old child. At 9 months of age, he had a history of fall, and after that had vomiting and then loss of consciousness. And after that, he recovered, but after that he had a remitting course, and always the manifestations exacerbated with infection. And later on, child developed dystonia. When we examined the child, he had a big head size and this typical MRI, which is suggestive of glutaric aciduria type 1. So you see this bitemporal atrophy, which is very, very characteristic of glutaric aciduria type 1. We investigated the child, turned out to be GA type 1, confirmed by molecular studies. So I would like to conclude by saying that probably inborn errors of